Um, I think a big thing that we want to do today is we want to get the talking done, and we want to get to some kind of workshopping. But to do that, we want to get just a few basics out. So we'll take a few minutes to talk about this at a couple of levels. On the one hand, I want to say, I think, very generally what we'll do, and then we'll sort of telescope in. We've got a series of workshops set up with regard to critical thinking that kind of target the Edison model, on the one hand, of critical thinking, and one of the most well-known comprehensive models out there in critical thinking, the Elder-Paul model from the Foundations of Critical Thinking. And so one of our goals is to establish a kind of an Edison perspective and show its connection to this more comprehensive Elder-Paul model. And part of the desire to develop this Edison perspective came out of the process to develop rubrics for our genetic competencies. And so, in terms of big picture, what we were doing there was trying to establish something fairly succinct and concise that we could use to establish some common language. And that's a big part of what we're here to do today. And you know, Professor Robinson and Professor Lavis, when you talk about trying to teach this and make it stick, and you say we can't do it in 16 weeks, absolutely right. I think it's going to have to be a team effort, curriculum-wide effort. And that's, again, that's big picture here. We're trying to establish some core competencies, some core skills that are pervasive throughout the gen ed and beyond here at the institution. And in order to make that work, we need some common vocabulary. So we could all perhaps give a pretty competent spiel on what we think critical thinking is, but until we as sort of a group and as a community get some core language that then our students are hearing over and over again, well, perhaps, we're spreading them out more than really focusing them in on something there. So I think our rubric roughly boils down to one mantra, which shockingly doesn't make it onto the rubric. So, please note this. I know I was sort of going back over our rubric in preparation for this, and I was kind of shocked to see that somehow we didn't really. But what we do is we try to say, okay, let's get it down to three core ideas. Critical thinking at Edison will be about three core ideas: analysis, evaluation, and justification. And I really think that should almost be, as lately I've described it, and forgive me for the martial nature of this metaphor, but it's sort of the tip of the spear, if you will. If we could all sort of understand what at Edison we mean by analysis, evaluation, justification, and it's fairly self-explanatory, but if we get on the same page about it, I think that will be the kind of simple three ideas that we sort of hammer away at throughout the gen ed and beyond, and give our students the best chance to look at that. And then, as I've said before, we want to sort of flesh out each of these three basic concepts here at Edison: analysis, evaluation, and justification, with concepts from the more comprehensive, more nuanced Elder-Paul model. And so the goal for today is to tackle that first step in the rubric, analysis, and then flesh that out using the elements of thought from the Elder-Paul model. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more later and come across it as we try to work with it as it applies to our classes. But one of the things we'll see from that Elder-Paul model is that the elements of thought overlap at times. Sometimes are not necessarily relevant to the kind of assignment you're giving. So those 8 basic elements of thought, some of them are going to be useful for helping our students to analyze. But that's where we want to start. We want to see how the 3 steps of the rubric can then be fleshed out into the more nuanced concepts of the Elder-Paul model. And if we as a community can get comfortable with what we mean by analysis, evaluation, and justification, and not only get comfortable with the language, but begin to help each other understand what that means in our different fields, I think that we would also do our students a good service. So today we're just focusing in on evaluation. In our next workshop we focus in on analysis today. And then our next workshop we do both evaluation and justification, because those, as I think I'll make clear in a moment, they just go hand in hand, of course. And then in the third workshop, we'll talk about, well, what does it mean to take this way of thinking and build it into a person's character, and then we get these traits or these virtues. Okay, so very generally, here was the thinking. We've got it down with these 3 steps, and again, going down, we're talking about simplest to most complex. Analysis, in the simplest sense of the word, is we're asking our students to work with something. What that something is turned out to be one of the great challenges in my field. It's working with somebody else's position, working with an argument, working with a theory. But that wasn't the case for the science folks or somebody working in the humanities or something like that. So sometimes it's working with somebody else's article, sometimes it's working with somebody else's speech, sometimes it's working with somebody else's work of art, somebody else's essay, sometimes it's working with just a big chunk of unexplained data, and we want to make some sense of it. Sometimes it's working with a problem, like we've got this problem, how are we going to solve it? And so what we try to do is we try to say that analysis is about identifying that something, whether it's the argument or the theory or the problem or the data. And we went with those 3 elements there. Identify either the unexplained data, the argument, or the problem. And in terms of better to worse, well, we kept it pretty simple. There's 1 out of 4, you don't do it. Let's say we've got a student who just simply fails to identify the problem or even see the real data, or, and unfortunately that happens. You just miss the whole thing. You just miss the whole target. Well, that's a 1. It's completely insufficient. Beginning. Well, you identified the problem. You identified what the other person was saying, but you didn't do it well. You really kind of missed their point, or you didn't describe the challenge or the problem well, whether it's in accounting or whatever. You tried, but you didn't do it. So it sort of didn't do it, did it poorly, did it mostly, did it completely well. And when we look at 4 steps, that on each line is it didn't do it, did it but it's poor, did it mostly, and we're going to have to use our judgment, obviously, whether we're distinguishing mostly and did it poorly. But this gets us started. And so again, just in that 1 horizontal row, you identify the something, and then we talk about how well we identify it. Now, we use the language of identify here, and this is where I'm kicking myself a little bit. We didn't really use the language of analysis. But to identify something and identify it well, you can't just say, well, this is it. You say, well, what is it? And as you begin to say what it is, well, then you're analyzing it. Well, this is, something that's round. You talk about its constituent elements, its parts, its characteristics, and whether this is an essay, a problem, a chunk of data, an accounting issue, a historical event, whatever it is, beginning to sort of break it down, and then ultimately, I think the elements may take us even deeper. So that's kind of the primer there.
Okay. And he's done the tip of the spear. Now we're going to flesh it out a little bit in what Drs. Paul and Elder use for their model. Or they call it the critical thinking framework. And as you can see, it's got 3 parts, and we're only going to work with 1 part today. And that's the most basic, the elements of thought. Let me just tell you a couple of things with this brief handout. At the top of the 2nd page, here are questions using the elements of thought that you can take from this workshop right into your classroom. And if you want to get to these areas, which we'll be working with today, you can use those questions. The second part of their framework are the universal intellectual standards. And this is sort of the way that we test whether or not our thinking is good. And the third part are the essential intellectual traits. And this is really the way that we determine whether or not our thinking is ethical. So we'll get, over the course of our study group, and I hope that we'll be together through the whole semester, we'll get to all of these. But today we're going to just talk about analysis, because that's the introduction we got from Dr. Swanson. Teaching English, teaching humanities, teaching anything, really, we always talk about valuing analysis, but I've never found a really great way to teach it. It's hard to teach somebody to break something down On the rubric, we're using the idea of identification. But, as Russell pointed out, when you're really identifying, you're going to have to go in many larger directions. You're going to have to discuss many different ideas. So, that's what we can do with this model, this basic elemental model. And I'm not going to talk about this very much today. We're going to use it. Because what I have found with the elements of critical thinking from the Paul Elder model is that I have to practice. I can't just talk about it. And I can't have somebody talk at me about it. I have to, it's like a puzzle. And I have to move the puzzle around. So we're going to look at an article today, because if I were teaching in my classroom, that's what I would be using. And actually, thanks to Professor Van Galen, I got the article, got this particular one from her. But we are going to look at it in these 8 different ways. First of all, we're going to say, what is the purpose of this article? What is the author's purpose? What's the question that's at issue? What's the basic information that we're going to be getting? What inferences, what conclusions has this author drawn when he or she came up with the argument? What are the assumptions, the presuppositions? What are the things that are being taken for granted in this argument? Which they're always there. What are the implications and the consequences if we take this to the end of the idea? And finally, what's the point of view? What's the frame of reference here? And is there any other frame of reference or point of view that we probably should be looking at? And that's all I'm going to say. And then I'm going to give you an article. It's called The Best Ways to Beat Terror. And I'm going to put you to work.
Makes sense.
Now, what I want to do is I want this table. First of all, we're going to have to read very quickly. We have a half an hour. And this is a bit dense. Definitely a freshman class could not do this in half an hour, but I think we can. I'm going to ask this table to read it quickly and to do the right half of the elements. See if you can do the first 4. What's the purpose? What's the question at issue? What's the primary information he's giving you? And what's the interpretation, inferences, conclusions that you come up with? This table, I want you to